I was talking to
Okay, go.
from high school.
Good morning. Welcome to the Adults Issues class. Today's topic, obviously, is standardized testing. I'm going to introduce myself for a minute, then I'm going to ask my husband to open with prayer. My name is Susan Hubbell. I'm a member of the Adult Christian Education Committee. I've been working in the field of education for about 30 years in different fields, and I've worked with a lot of standardized tests, which gives me the opportunity to present but not be an expert. So Howard, I'll ask you if you'll open with prayer and then we'll start.
Dear Most Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to gather here in freedom and comfort. We ask the blessing on this course, the blessing on the participants, and the blessing on this church. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, raise your hand if you've ever taken a standardized test. Okay, how do you know?
I'm looking at the slide up there.
No.
I've done that.
Now, how do you know it was a standardized test?
I can't tell you any longer.
Well, sometimes they would tell you. You took this test every couple of years in school, and you knew that's what it was.
Okay.
And I took the SATs.
Yep.
That was about the biggest standard.
SATs, BSATs.
Yeah.
It comes from an organization,
What makes it a standardized test?
an organization that kind of assembles it and wrestles with it and molds it into whatever it is, as opposed to one individual.
Okay, anybody else? I'm going to give you a definition. A standardized test is a type of assessment that is designed, administered, and scored in a consistent manner for all of the test takers. The same type of questions, the same time limits, the same instructions are given for every test for every student. They're done in an objective manner, and that's to reduce individual bias, individual opinions. So most standardized tests are objective. There are three types of standardized tests. One is ability. That would be like an IQ type test, a psychological test. Another type of standardized test is an achievement test. I think in Pennsylvania, all our kids take Stanford achievement tests in elementary school, and that measures the achievement, how much you have learned. And the third test, which I love, it's my favorite, is psychological testing, and that's a type of standardized testing as well. So why do we give standardized tests? Why bother? What's the purpose of them?
I've asked that for generations.
Supposedly to see how the school measures up to everybody else who takes the test.
Okay, to see how to school, to compare schools, to compare districts, to compare regions. Why else would we give a standardized test?
Also to see how the children supposedly
To
progress.
see how the children do? Okay, well, I have some reasons. One is to measure skills and knowledge, see how much the kids have learned and how much they're able to apply it. Another, what Linda said, is to compare performance of different school districts, different regions. Another is to determine placement. Where do you want, like when kids go to college, which first year English class do you want to put them into? Or schools, do you want to put them in an AP class? Do they qualify for an AP class? Do they have the knowledge that we'll be able to get there? So placement. Also to determine special education students and students for gifted education, you have standardized tests to do that. We use standardized tests to evaluate programs. Let's see how well this particular program went. So that's another reason. And another that I think is interesting is that we use them sometimes to justify, stop it, you two in the back row, naughty. We use standardized tests to justify what we're doing. Look, here's the results. This, we should get more money next year because this is what the standardized test shows. Okay, so those are reasons for standardized testing. Push my little thing here. Okay, now, because this is a very dry topic, I wanted to put a little bit of humor in it. And if you can't read it, it says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please, climb that tree. And we have a monkey and a penguin and an elephant and a goldfish and a walrus and a dog. Okay. Obviously, they're not all going to be able to do that task. So there are some limitations to standardized testing too, and when you can use them and how you can use them. let's talk about types of standardized testing. The ones that we use predominantly here in Pennsylvania are the ACT and SATs for college admission. We do the Pennsylvania State System of Assessment, PSSA testing. Most tests have their own individual state assessments. In Massachusetts, it was the MCATs, here it's the PSSA. There's IQ and psychological tests, and there's also achievement tests like the Stanford Achievement that we give to the elementary school here in the United States. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the SAT and ACT tests because I think that we use them. I think those are the ones that we think about when we think about standardized tests. Both are equally accepted by colleges. Neither one is better than the other, although I think we hear about the SAT tests more than we hear about the ACT tests. There are just a few differences. The SAT tests, you get a little bit more time for them. The ACT tests are a little bit faster paced, that you got to move through it a little bit faster. As far as the math content, and this kind of got to me because math content in the SATs, it focuses on algebra and data analysis, whereas in the ACT, it includes more geometry and trigonometry. Now to me, that's, if you're familiar with right brain and left brain, geometry is a very right-brained math. It's a visual math. You see pictures, you see different things, and to my way of thinking, oh, if I were right-brained, which I am, the ACT test would be better. But then they put in trigonometry. Algebra is a very left-brain math, and the content in the SATs is mostly algebra. They don't give you any formulas in the ACT test. In the SATs, they do give you the formulas. So if you're going to take the ACT test, you need to memorize your formulas before you go. There's no science section in the SATs, but there's a scientific reasoning section in the ACTs that doesn't test your scientific knowledge. It doesn't ask you to do scientific problems. It basically determines how well you can figure things out given certain data. When you score them, the SATs, they go up to, they start at 400 and they go up to 1600. And sometimes you'll see in the paper, Harvard student got 1600s on SATs and whatnot. That's the highest you can get. On the ACTs, it's a 36 point scale. Okay? I'm going to talk just about the ACTs. They're administered by ACT Incorporated. The sections are English, math, reading, science, and there's an optional essay. You don't have to do it, but you can do it. So the time given to take that test would be determined by whether or not you chose to do the essay. Okay. Both are college entrance exams. They're both used by colleges and universities for admission. However, many colleges now are not requiring them. Many colleges will take a different form of assessment like a portfolio or standards-based assessment. So the days of sweating out the ACTs and the SATs, who took SATs or ATs, ever take them? Yeah, okay. The days of sweating those out are not as much now as they used to be when we were in high school years ago. The SAT is administered by the College Board. The sections are reading, writing and language, math. They have two sections, calculator, no calculator. And they used to have an essay. Now they don't have it anymore. So the ACT has an essay. The SAT does not anymore. Okay, let's move on. Pennsylvania System of School Assessment. This is a standards-based test. Anybody know what standards-based test means? Don't shake your head. It measures how well students do on a specific task. There's your standard. It's standard-based. It aligns with the curriculum. You've heard of teaching for the test? Okay, PSSA, and schools do not discourage teachers from doing that. Fortunately, teachers know that they have a certain amount of curriculum that they have to cover during the school year. So teaching to the test isn't a really good option. But if schools base your evaluation as a teacher on your standardized test results, you might be more inclined to teach to the test. It's a criterion referenced test. Can anybody tell me what criterion referenced means? Oh my goodness. The performance is measured against a set of standards, not against other people. So your performance is, your score is how well you achieved a certain standard, not where you are in class rank or where you are in the nation or things like that. It's criterion reference. There are grade level expectations. There are different categories below basic, proficient, and advanced. You want your students to be at least proficient. There are different categories on the Pennsylvania System of School Assessment, and schools use them to compare their progress against other schools, to compare progress in different regions, to look at one class versus another class. You might have kids grouped in different ways, homogeneously, heterogeneously. You look at these results to see how your groupings work out. Now we're going to do a little fun event, because standardized testing is dull. Okay. Who has heard of a Rorschach test?
Heard of it.
Who's ever taken one? I didn't think so. Okay, if you read the book Flowers for Algernon, Charlie in the book is given a Rorschach test. It's a psychological test. It's not as standardized as a lot of tests because the scoring on it is very subjective. The psychologist interprets the scoring. So even though the pictures and the slides are identical, and the only instructions that you give to the test taker are, tell me what you see, they're scored subjectively, so they can't really be 100% a standardized test. But this is actually one of the inkblots. There are 10 of them. Some of them are in color, and some of them are not in color. So I'm going to look at this, and I'm going to say, tell me what you see. Okay.
I see a flower and 2 ticks.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? What do you see? Go ahead.
I first am drawn to what I think are seahorses at the top.
Okay.
And then I initially kind of pull back and I'm like, there are 2 upside down pairs of pliers in there.
Okay.
A green handled pair and a pink handled
All
pair.
right. Okay. And part of the scoring of the Rorschach depends on, interestingly, where you look in the picture. If you look at the whole picture, it tells you one thing about a person. If you look at it into individual parts of the picture, it tells you another thing about the person. Okay? Now, we're going to go. What do you see in that one?
Bug splatter.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Bug splatter on
Bug
windshield.
splatter?
Don't get much
Tell me what you see.
Yeah, to me, it looks like a winged creature, some type with the 2 little pinchers out front, and the eyes bugging out there, and it's
Let's say I gave this to a client, and the client looked at this and they said, I see 2 men killing each other and there's lots of blood.
Okay.
And then you show them this picture, and you say, what do you see in that picture? They said, oh, that's all the blood and guts spilled all over the place that, when the 2 men were killing each other. Then you get back to this picture and you say, do you see anything else in the thing? Yeah, there's 2 things at the top of guns, and they're waiting for people to come into the room so that they can shoot them all down. What can you, and you can't answer this because you can't answer. What can you tell me about that client from those things that they said?
He's afraid.
is he pulling your leg?
No, seriously, what do you think you could tell me
Fear
about
of
that?
violence.
I'm sorry?
Fear of violence.
Violent,
Very angry.
angry,
Yeah.
anybody else? Okay, the answer is nothing, because you never determine what you want to know about a client based on only one test.
Okay.
Okay, and that's why I stuck that in. If you have a standardized test and you're inclined to think something about a particular person or student, you need to follow that up with another type of a test to affirm what your theories are.
Yeah.
You never do it based on just one test. Okay? Lots of other standardized tests that you will hear about. ASVAB is if you want to go into the military, and that determines, number one, whether or not you can qualify for the military. And we've all seen the movies with the one guy who should never have been accepted into the military, and he's probably on the front line and the first one to get shot. But that determines, number one, whether or not you qualify for the military, and number two, there's different subtests that determines whether, which particular areas of the military you would be most successful in. And that, some of that would be determined by the education that you have, and some of it will be determined by your innate abilities. And there's also a second section, the AFQT, and that's a part of the ASVAB, and that is another way of determining which field you would be most successful in. Next one is the LSAT. If you want to go to law school, you apply for admission to law school, you're going to have to take the LSATs. Next one is the MCAT, same thing for medical school. If you want to go to medical school, you have to do, you can't get out, but you have to take the MCATs. GREs, although these are used much less frequently than they used to be. If you want to go into graduate school, get your master's, get your doctorate, you have to take your GRE. A lot of schools are waiving that now. They figure if you do well enough to get the grades that would support graduate school admission, you don't have to prove by taking another test. But that's a test that some colleges, usually some of the Ivy League, more the higher end colleges, might still require that, but very, very few do anymore.
Susan, I'm imagining that different colleges might have a different standard on these tests.
Yes, like same thing with college boards. You talk about a college like Harvard, they're going to require you to have close to 1,600 on your college boards. Where a college like Elizabethtown, Berlin, that I attended, they don't require you to have that high scores.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, a lot of colleges now are waiving the ACTs and the SATs in lieu of a performance-based assessment or a portfolio or something. And there are reasons for that, which I'll get into in a little bit.
I guess guidance counselors become part of that too at the high schools.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And middle school and elementary.
okay, thank you.
Praxis. Thank goodness they didn't have praxis when I went into teaching. However, it's a test for teachers to determine that they have the knowledge that they should have to be teaching. And there are general praxis, and then there are specialized. If you're going to be a history teacher, there's a history praxis. When you are a counselor, back when I was a counselor, the counselors had to take the praxis in every subject in the grade level that they were working. Now they have a counselor's test. But back then, when they first implemented the praxis, you had to take it in every subject. I don't know why, because you never use it, but that was it. They have a lot of pre-employment tests. A lot of businesses use tests, more psychological, but sometimes achievement tests. And the standardized test for business, cognitive ability test, skills assessments, personality tests, emotional intelligence, integrity tests. I don't know really how you measure someone's integrity, but I guess there are ways to do it. Situational judgment test, language proficiency. Somebody could come in and interview really well, but really not be able to write a letter. So before you get hired in a particular, by a particular company, they may want to give you some of these tests. Some of the larger law firms and corporations, they do want you to take a personality test and an emotional educational test, because They want to make sure you're going to be able to get along with other people. You may have a great IQ, great scores, great grades, and the minute you interact with somebody, you turn them off. So they want to measure this before they put out all that money to hire you. Now that we have the field of AI, there are AI-specific tests. One of them is called the Basic Artificial Intelligence Knowledge Skills. Another one is the Certified Artificial Intelligence Practitioner, and there's about 50 of them now to work in AI, none of which I would pass. And I don't know how you are familiar with AI, but to me it's something that I'm just learning right now. So we have those tests. Now, what are some of the problems of standardized tests? Why aren't they always good? And I have to tell you, I have to come out and say I'm not a fan of most standardized testing. I think it takes a lot of time. It could be devoted to other things. It's very impersonal, and I'm just not a big fan of it. But let's say let's say you're a high school junior and you're going to take the SATs for the first time, and you're on your way in. And while you're on your way in, your girlfriend or boyfriend texts you and they say, "We're done, I don't want to see you anymore." How's that going to impact how you do on the test?
I remember a teacher in high school once saying that they were very poor at taking tests. Some people take them better than others.
Okay.
I guess you get nervous to some extent, that kind of thing.
Some kids are natural test takers. Other people stress out when they're in that environment. Some people can just take tests. I did a paper when I was in college about standardized tests, and my theory was that 75% of the time, if you didn't know the answer, pick B, and B was the right answer. And I did a lot of research on that, and it's true. It is true. And then down at the bottom of my test, I said, or of my paper, I said, this paper deserves A. For letter A, I put a B. And for letter B, I put an A. Yeah, hoping that my teacher would choose letter B and give me an A. But there are a lot of different things that can affect standardized testing. I just gave you one of them. What might be some of the other ones?
Cultural.
Cultural. Okay, most standardized tests have a bit of cultural bias. They assume that you know this, but if you live in a different culture, you may not know it. So we're going to play a game now. And I need 2 volunteers, so I'm going to ask my husband as one, and anybody else. Wally, would you like to be a volunteer? Okay, come on up.
I would imagine that personality is part of this too, because
Absolutely.
different people and going into different occupations, personality might have a lot to do with their success.
Okay, I want each of you to pick a thing of cards. Okay, and don't look at them yet. I want you both to stand over there next to each other, like sort of in the middle. And this is a little game I have. It's called Risk and What do you want?
Do you want them on camera?
I
Just
want you
come
over
over.
this way a little bit more.
Good, right there,
Okay.
right there.
It's called Risk and Resiliency. What I want you to do is, one at a time, I want you to turn over one of your cards and read it. If you think it's a risk, I want you to take 2 steps back. If you think it's resiliency, I want you to take 1 step forward. Okay? If you think it would hurt you, take 2 steps back. If you think it would help you, take 1 step forward. And the first person who gets to me gets a monetary reward. Okay? So Wally, read your first thing.
Should I read it out loud?
Yes.
Your parent loses a job.
Your parent loses a job. Is that a risk or a resiliency? It's a risk. He went 2 steps back. Howard?
The school you attend is one of the highest rated in the state.
Is that a risk or a resiliency? Now, don't get theoretical here.
I'm going to say it's resiliency.
It is. Okay. Wally?
Family car breaks down and you don't have the money to get it fixed.
Okay.
Well, teach resilience. Yeah.
Your parents are college graduates. Oh, that's resilience.
Okay.
Your parents do not speak fluent English.
seen it.
Oh.
I had some bad situations, I'm gonna try to look on the other side of it.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Howard?
You have your own room with a private study area. Oh, that's a good idea, yeah, okay.
We share a bedroom with 3 other siblings.
Put on here, Wally.
That would be great for being in college, right? You're extremely college.
No.
You get a new laptop for your birthday.
Your parents did not graduate from high school.
Your parent gets a job promotion and a salary increase.
You done? Okay, well, since Howard won, I'm going to give him this $1 and thank him for his time.
I can spend it however
You
I
can
want.
spend it however you want, that is all yours. And Wally, now look, I know you're trying hard. You need to try a little bit harder. So to reward you, I'm going to give you this $quarter. Be careful how you spend it. Try and spend it on something that will, enrich your life a little bit more so you're not doing such a poor job. There you go. Okay. What did I just illustrate?
Bias.
Yeah, you can really have $1. You can have the
Same way, but that's- I'll use it for Leo next time I find him here.
What did I just illustrate?
Bias.
Bias, yeah.
Well, not exactly.
Okay.
I illustrated 2 things. One of the things that I illustrated was some of the things that could affect how you did on a standardized test. If English is not your first language, that could affect things. If you live in a situation where you share a bedroom and you don't have any time to really study it, there's no quiet, that could affect things. If your parents didn't graduate from high school, there's probably not a big priority, not necessarily, but there's probably not a big priority on education. And, on the other hand, if your dad has a great job, your parents graduate from college, mom or dad keeps getting salary increases, things like that, you have your own room, you have your own laptop, those are all things that are going to encourage your standardized testing abilities, and you will probably score higher. And when you think about it, schools only have children for a few hours a day. They're in their home situation for much more. So there's a lot that impacts a standardized test other than just what they learned in school. There's something else that I want to mention. Grant money is awarded based on standardized testing. And if you look at what I did, here comes Howard with all the advantages. I gave him the most money because he got the scores. And then came Wally. And Wally had a lot of disadvantages and really could have used that money. It probably would have improved the school and individual performances. But he didn't have the scores, so he got a lower grant amount. And that's just something that I'd like to illustrate by doing that. And thank you both for what you do. Okay.
And I get that they probably do it that way because they have to show something to judge everybody by some sort of standard in order to justify giving this money. If you do it by score, at least you have some measurement of why you're giving this money. How do you measure it otherwise?
Well, you could look at the scores and say they need the money more.
But then how do you know who does and who doesn't?
I don't know.
Yeah. I'm just saying I can see why they would do that. Not that it's right. I'm just saying I can see why.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Where do people typically think their money is best spent? Where you have the best chance of success?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Business decisions.
I think statistics have shown that the more money that is spent per student yields higher results on standardized testing and all other different areas. But once again, when you go to individual districts, who determines how that money is going to be spent? I worked in a district that I know had, we got a lot of money from something called student assistance, which was to combat drug and alcohol use. And each school got $5,000. And I wanted to use our $5,000 to bring in speakers to our school. And our student director said, oh, no, we're not giving the money to individual schools. That's all one big fund, which it wasn't supposed to be. But it just determines, who's at the helm determines how that money's gonna be spent, so you have to be careful who you elect. Okay. What kinds of things can't be measured on a standardized test?
What I said earlier, personality,
Personality,
which some jobs you might end up taking have to do with how outward you are and how much you would talk to people, be an introvert or an extrovert.
okay? What else can't be measured?
Innate ability.
No, I think you can determine ability. What, you must mean something different than I'm thinking of.
Innate ability.
Innate.
Okay,
Your natural, what your natural skills are as opposed to those that you have built by education.
Okay.
There's a difference in those two.
I think maybe one way to tease that out, I've heard in the past that there's a distinct difference between ignorance and intelligence. And I think that maybe is part of what you're getting at.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right, okay. Can you measure integrity? This person that you're gonna pay, $250,000 a year who's got all these skills, can you measure whether or not he's gonna rob you?
Nope.
How about compassion? Can you measure compassion?
You
On a
give them-
standardized test.
You can give them situational, situations that they need to answer how they would do, what they would do. You can get an idea, but if somebody actually knows what they're looking for, they will answer that
Right,
correctly.
and it's also not,
So
it's also not standardized,
So it
because
wouldn't be
you're
measured.
scoring for something that would have to be subjective, not objective. Can you measure creativity? Wally, you're,
I think maybe a little. Again, it needs to be kind of more open and question, but,
okay,
These are abstracts.
okay. All right, well, back in, I think it was 1993, a man named Gardner came up with something called a multiple intelligence theory. And I will say that I support this 100%. And his theory is that everybody has certain amounts of all these different kinds of intelligences. For example, the interpersonal, understanding how well you understand yourself and how well do you know what your limitations and your abilities are. The next one is, well, there should be the next, okay. So the linguistic, how good are you with words and putting words together and writing. Then there's the body kinesthetic, there's where your athletes come in. How coordinated are you? How well can you use your body to do the tasks that you want to do? Then there's interpersonal, which is how well do you get along with other people. Going around existential, I always have a problem with this, but why do we live? Why do we die? What's the purpose of our life? Those types of questions. Or do you have intelligence in that area? Logical, mathematical. Coming around musical. Naturalist, that would be nature, how well you're in tune with nature. And then at the very top, spatial, do you see the world in 3D? Do you envision yourself interacting in the world? Unfortunately, there are really not ways to measure a lot of these intelligences. For most standardized tests, they measure math and verbal. When you do an IQ test on a student, it measures math and verbal, which really limits some students. Now, one of the reasons why I subscribe to this theory is you can have an artist who is extremely creative and paints gorgeous pictures, and they're in a car accident, and they have some brain damage, and they can still paint beautiful pictures, but they have to look at something to do it. They can't create it in their head. So different areas of the brain account for different things that we are able to do. You could have somebody who gets along really well with others, and they have some sort of brain injury, and they wind up a very angry person. You can identify, and I can't tell you what these are off the top of my head, but you can identify different areas of the brain that are responsible for these different forms of intelligence. Now, we talked about gifted, and we talked about special education, learning deficiencies. If you have a scale and right in the middle is 100, 30 points to the right of that is considered significant. So a gifted IQ would be 130 plus. 30 points to the left of that would be considered significant, and they would be your special education students in the we used to say mentally retarded, mentally challenged category. So it's a 30-point spread on each side of 100. That is significant. However, I did say, when we give intelligence tests to students, when students are in elementary school, they take the Stanford Achievement Tests, and they also take the Otis Lynn School Ability Test, which is basically it's an intelligence test. And they use that as their initial screening for the gifted program. And if the students score like 140 something in the, on the Otis Lynn end, they will usually recommend them to be tested for gifted. When you test a student for gifted education, they have something called a WISC-R, which is a type of intelligence test. And they'll give that to the student. It's a one-on-one thing. The counselor or psychologist administers the test one-on-one, and if the student scores 130 or above, they're automatically placed in the gifted program. What it doesn't measure is all those other intelligences beyond math and verbal. Now, there are some people who say an individual who is truly gifted is gifted in all of these areas, and we all know somebody. We all know somebody who can play the piano or sing, and they're really good in school, and they can build things, and we all know somebody like that who excels in all of these areas. But that's not what the school uses. The school uses a cutoff of 130, and if you make the 130, you get into the gifted program, and if you are 70 or below, you receive some sort of full-out special education. Okay, any questions?
Can't get a negative score, right?
Only for you. Okay, what do I have here next? Oh, no, I don't want to do that. When you take a standardized test, one of the things that they don't think about that really affects your ability to do well on the test is the environment that you're in when you take it. And I'll give you an example. When my daughter was in elementary school, she was screened for gifted. And the woman who screened her came in from the outside, sat in a cubicle in the library and smoked while my daughter took the test. And we're so anti-smoking in our house because my dad passed away from lung cancer. So all of her life I was telling Kimberly, you don't want to smoke, smoking's bad, don't get into it, don't even think about it. So she's in this room with this woman who's chain smoking, and she came out of it and she cried and she said, she asked me which side the sun rose, and I said the west, and I knew it was the east, but I couldn't think. Okay, so the environment where the student takes the test can make a big difference. I took her to a private psychologist to be retested, and there was a 34-point difference. So it is what it is. Okay. Any other questions about any of the material that I mentioned?
Yes.
Of course.
Well,
Go ahead.
all these types of standardized tests that you've listed here, who decides what level makes it or doesn't make it? I mean,
Usually people who have never spent a day in the classroom.
Okay.
True. A bunch of corporate people for a testing agency like Pearson, SAT, or ACT, yeah. But basically what they do is they aggregate all this data and they chunk it, and they say, all right, like the people who did well, like the top 10%, this was their score. And then the next 10%, this was their scoring range. And they do it based on aggregated data.
Okay.
But the majority of standardized tests that are written for public schools are written by people who have never spent a day in the classroom. And this story is true. The Secretary of Education in the state of Massachusetts climbed out a window to avoid having to take the test. He was and I know this because my brother was an educator in Massachusetts and he witnessed this, but they were in a meeting and they were talking about the MCATs. And this man climbed out a window to avoid taking the test. He refused to take it, and they kept saying, no, you can't take it, and he went out the window. So the majority of standardized tests are created by people they may be educators, but they haven't had much classroom time, but they think they know a lot about education because they've studied the theories.
But emotional state,
Hmm?
emotional state vastly skews how you're going to do on anything.
When
I mean, if you are happy, if I don't care what form of the intelligence you're talking about, if you're in a really good mood or happy, you're going to do so much better than if you're not.
That's exactly right.
Saying standardized is just kind of a, oxymoron?
Well, well, what I said in the beginning is that I'm not really a big fan of standardized tests for reasons like this. When you take a standardized test, it's not like a movie. It's a snapshot of how you did at that particular time under those particular circumstances, how you were feeling that day, what your emotional state was in those 3 hours. You could take that same test a week later and there could be some different circumstances in your life and your scoring would be entirely different. And that's why they recommend that students take the PSAT in the beginning of 11th grade so that they get to practice SAT tests. And then they take the SAT once in 11th grade and then once or even twice in 12th grade. And the SAT will take the highest scores. You could, it doesn't matter which order they were, whatever your highest scores are in either category will be accepted by the SAT. So you're absolutely right. There are so many things that affect how you will perform on a standardized test, and it's just a snapshot. That's all it is. Now, it gives you a guide, but it still is just a snapshot. Yes?
Well, I remember, and this is, of course, back in the dark ages, when New York had a lot of standardized
Oh,
testing,
yeah.
like every year. And I remember the teachers here in Pennsylvania saying that they teach to the test
Mm-hmm.
because they know what kinds of answers are going to be there. But also, one of the times that I took the SAT, a woman in my class who was a very good student crashed and burned really badly because she had a bad cold that morning. And, it was back when you paid your money and you took the
You had
test.
to do it.
They
Yeah.
said it.
You're not staying home, I already paid for this.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, like I said, there are a lot of things that can determine how well you do on a standardized test. And some of them are within your control, but a lot of them aren't. So that's why more and more colleges are moving towards a portfolio-based assessment, like you put together a portfolio of things that you did in high school and submit that, and they would be able to tell. It would be harder for them because they would have to take the time to go through each individual portfolio, but they would get just as good, if not a better idea of your abilities than a standard test. However, there are some people, no matter how hard they try, they could be straight A students and they're just not test takers. And they tell you on the SATs, do not guess, because they score the number of right minus the number wrong. I think that's right, yeah. And so if you don't guess, that's not a number wrong, it's just not factored into it. And you're going to be tempted to guess, because I was anyway. So there are a lot of things that can affect it. I would go with a portfolio assessment. When I taught school, I always gave my students 3 ways to show that they knew, like if we did a chapter in social studies. They could either do a project, do a classroom presentation, or take a test. Whichever they wanted to do, and that would be their grade on the end of, at the end of that particular unit. Some kids did projects because they knew their parents would do them for them, obviously. Yeah. And a lot of kids like to get up front and talk to their peers, and so they like to stand up front. The kids who were really, really smart usually just took the test because they didn't have to study, they could blow it off and do no work. But I always gave them 3 options to evaluate them. So there's a lot of different ways to evaluate other than standardized tests. Any other questions?
Is there, I was just going to say, is there anybody besides higher education facilities that are interested in the results?
Well, businesses,
And can businesses get the results of these standardized testings?
if you choose to give them to them.
Okay.
But they usually, the tests that I show, when they give you the tests that to enter the business world, there are ability tests, aptitude tests, achievement tests included in that. They have their own tests.
And if you get these tests during, say you're in high school, do the school itself look to see whether maybe how they can improve by the scores?
Not on the SATs or PSATs, because they're given just to you, they're not given to the school. Well,
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna back up on that, I'm not sure anymore. They
Okay.
didn't used to give them to the schools. But a Stanford Achievement Test, for example, that the students take in elementary school, those are great if they're used right, because they have different, like the different sections that you're teaching in class, and you can look at them. They give them in the spring, so when you start your teaching, when you get your class in the fall, you can look at these tests and say, oh, these 5 kids really didn't understand fractions.
Mhm.
So maybe we'll do a little bit of fractions, pull these kids out and do something on fractions.
Makes sense.
They're great diagnostic tools.
Great.
As far as the SATs, I don't think that they release them to anybody other than the client and people that the client select to colleges that the client approves, and they'll send them directly. I honestly don't know whether they release them to schools.
Okay, thank
I
you.
don't know.
I was just gonna add that I think that we're in a good place, or at least heading towards a good place, as far as realizing things like what neurodiversity really means.
Mhm.
You know, I think realizing that people are more complicated than any series of buckets that you can put them in. I know someone who was involved in medical school admissions over the years. And that individual would often go really deep into applications beyond the MCAT score, grades, and all those sorts of things. And I remember hearing a story of 2 people that otherwise were identical other than GPAs. Information was not shared, so it was very anonymous. But two people were identical other than GPAs. And this person decided to do a little bit more digging. Well, it turns out the kid with the slightly lower GPA, and it wasn't really profound from what I understand, is basically grew up as a farm kid and actually was a farm kid throughout their entire college experience. So who do I want in my medical school program? Do I want somebody who actually is up at 5 o'clock in the morning, does 3 or 4 hours worth of work before they come to class, after class goes home, does 3 or 4 hours of work, then gets their studies?
That's a very good point.
Yeah, there are people more complicated than a series of buckets.
The term neurodiverse is fairly new.
Yeah, that's, yep.
I think it's great. I think it's a great term because we are all neurodiverse. If you want to look at specific criteria and somebody doesn't conform to that, I don't subscribe to that, but we are all neurodiverse. If you put all of us in the same room and told us to observe a situation, we would have several different interpretations of that because we're diverse. And thank goodness, it would be boring if we weren't. Any other questions? Okay, well now I do have, I'm going to go to one last slide. Somebody mentioned about introverted and extroverted. This is Myers-Briggs, and this is called a Keirsey temperament scale. And it's a test that is given to people, and pardon me, it is a standardized test. And you take it, and then it's scored uniformly, and based on your score, you are categorized as one of these different people, and they have the INTJ. I means introverted as opposed to E, extroverted. The N means intuitive as opposed to the S, which is more spontaneous. Okay, so you can fall into these different profiles, and surprisingly, the test is really accurate. It also gives you an indication as to whether or not you're right-brained or left-brained. Right-brained people tend to be, most Asian people are right-brained. They tend to be on the creative side, better in music and arts and things than if you're left-brained. But that's not, it's not cut in stone, just a guideline. But anyway, those are the categories. And in closing, I'm going to give everybody one of those tests to take home. If you want to take it and get it back to me, I'll score it and I'll give you, now there's not a right or wrong answer in any, so when I say score, you're not going to get like a 90% in personality, which says you've got 90% personality. It's not that kind of a test. It's a score to tell you the type of personality traits that you have, and I think you'd be surprised at how accurate it is. If you want to take it and you want me to score it, just get it back, bring it back to the church and tell, in the office and tell them to give it to me. If you don't want to put your name on it because you don't want me to know, put some kind of an identifying mark on it, I'll score it. I will give you a printout of your personality type, and you can see whether you think or not it's accurate. Any other questions? Howard, I'm going to ask you to close with prayer, and the forms, the tests are back there in the back table. Grab one on your way out and have fun doing it. Okay?
Most Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this opportunity to learn collectively for a subject that is obviously on our minds at various points, particularly if we have kids. Lord, we thank you for the peaceful assembly as we go about our business safely. Amen.
Yeah, amen.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I hope you learned something. I hope it wasn't dry. I hope you had fun. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to call.